Good afternoon, everybody. My name is David Goodman. I'm the Director of the China Studies Centre at the University of Sydney. Before we begin the proceedings today, I'd like to acknowledge on behalf of everybody present that this webinar is hosted on the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I would like to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, acknowledge them as the traditional custodians of the land on which we all are. Welcome to you all. This is something of a new development for us. We're cooperating between two universities across the road in Sydney, between UTS, the Australia-China Research Institute, and the University of Sydney's China Studies Centre. I expect the road to open up at any moment, but who knows what will happen. The China Studies Centre, as some of you will know, brings together researchers on China from across all faculties and disciplines at the university and enables international academic collaboration with people from China and around the world to look at China indeed. UTS's Australia-China Research Institute is an independent, non-partisan research institute which was established in 2014 by the University of Technology, Sydney, as Australia's first and only research institute devoted to looking at the Australia-China bilateral relationship. UTS Australia-China Research Institute seeks to inform Australia's engagement with China through research, analysis, and dialogue grounded in scholarly rigour. Today, we're having this roundtable on prospects for China's economy this year. And it's a great pleasure to welcome three very senior figures to speak. The first is Professor Yiping Huang from Beida, who is the Sinar Mas Chair of Professor of Finance and Economics, as well as Deputy Dean of the National School of Development and Director of the Institute of Digital Finance. Currently, he's also Deputy Secretary General of the China Society of Finance and Banking, Chairman of the Special Committee on FinTech Development and Research of the National Internet Finance Association of China, Chairman of the Academic Committee of the China Finance Forum, 40 Forum, a member of the Chinese Economist 50 Forum, editor of China Economic Journal, an associate editor of Asian Economic Policy Review, and an independent director of the Art Group and China Life Insurance. I wonder how he has time to come and talk to us after all that, but it's very nice to have him here. His key research interests are macroeconomy and finance policy, and he's really a well-established authority in this field, as most of you will know. Then we have Jane Golly, who's a professor and economist at the Crawford School at ANU, Public Policy at Australian National University. She's a member of the advisory board of the Australia-China Research Institute at UTS, and she was co-editor of the China Story Yearbook series from 2016 to 2021, including Crisis, published in 2021. She served as the president of the Chinese Economic Society of Australia and the Chinese Studies Association of Australia. She's currently an executive member of the Australia-China Business Council, and she's the ACT representative on the New South Wales State Advisory Council of CEDA, which is a not inconsiderable role. The third person we have speaking today is Su-Lin Tan, who, amongst other things, is my favourite correspondent on the South China Morning Post. She's the Asia correspondent for the South China Morning Post. She joined the publication in 2020 after she had been working on at the Australian Financial Review, where she used to cover housing and commercial property, Asian business, and street talk and investigation. She's a qualified accountant and she worked in investment banking and funds management, both in London and Sydney, before becoming a journalist, which is again, very exhausting, I would think. Today's moderator is an equally as famous economist, as it happens, Professor James Lawrenson, who's the director of the Australia-China Research Institute at UTS. He's previously held appointments at the University of Queensland, at Shandong University, and in Japan at Shimonoseki City University. He was president of the Chinese Economic Society of Australia from 2012 to 2014. And his academic research has been published in leading scholarly journals. And he also does, as everybody I think knows, provide regular commentary on contemporary developments on China's economy and Australia-China economic relationship, both generally and through various different kinds of media. And now I'm going to hand over to Professor Lawrenson, to James, to begin the discussion and to moderate the discussion. Over to you, James.
Thanks so much, David. It's great to be co-hosting this event with the China Studies Centre. I'm focused on the Australia-China relationship. Professor David Goodman, of course, is a genuine sinologist. So it's a real privilege for us to be linking up with him and his team over at Sydney University. Look, I want to get straight into it. We've only got an hour and there's a lot to talk about. Yiping, I'd like to go to you first. You're on the ground in Beijing. And let me background my first question to you in this way. I've been following the Chinese economy myself for a long time, 25 odd years. And I typically have found myself over that period as being a bit more bullish about China's economic prospects than, say the average Australian analyst of the Chinese economy. But nowadays, I've got to admit, watching Beijing's approach for dealing with COVID-19 is, causing even someone like me to wonder where China's growth is going to come from, particularly over the next 12 months. Now, aside from that short-term challenge, none of the long-standing structural challenges that we're all familiar with, demographics, debt, the low household income share of GDP, and so on, none of those have disappeared. There's also been a story, I think probably from around 2016, amplified further since 2020, of Beijing cracking down on some of the more productive parts of China's economy, the private sector, and more recently, the tech giants. So, Yiping, I'd just like to start by giving you the virtual floor to give us your assessment of where we're at. I mean, where do you come down on all these issues? Over to you, Yiping.
Well, I think, James, there are two sets of issues we're facing at the moment. The first set of the issues are more near-term, short-term factors. So the economy is being hit by the pandemic and a weakening of the more volatile global economy and so on. In particular, at the moment, we are faced with a very tough challenge of this divergence between the producer price and the consumer price. As you know, most of the Chinese producers are at the lower stream of the supply chain, which means if PPI is high, CPI is low, their profit margins being substantially squeezed. At the same time, as you mentioned, the pandemic policy, I think we are continuing with a zero tolerance policy, which is a restricting movement of people and economic transactions. And I'm based in Beijing at the moment. For the past year or two, we're actually doing fine. But recently now, I think it's becoming a bit nervous. So we're doing this PCR checks almost every other day and so on. So these are the things I think affecting slowing of economic activities. The bigger question now is really what kind of macroeconomic stimulus the government is willing to provide to support growth. We are seeing monetary policy, we are seeing fiscal policy doing some jobs, but many feel that more should be done. And we just heard that there was a policy meeting yesterday, and the president said we needed to spend more on infrastructure. Hopefully, that will be a big support to growth. Although at the same time, I'm a bit worried about the micro level risks. The small, medium enterprises and the low-income household have been suffering during that process, and now it's entering into the third year. So I think cash flow challenge is quite serious for these. So you have a big, a top macroeconomic policy issue, but also you have a big microeconomic challenge we have to face. That's the first set of the near-term issue. The second set is what you just mentioned on the longer-term policies. Last year, one of the reasons why growth slowed so much was also because of the implementation of a very large number of structural policies. So like the big tech platforms on the education tutorial system, on the energy efficiency and carbon neutrality and so on, and plus the common prosperity. All these policies, in my view, are necessary to lift the quality of growth in China. So they are actually necessary, but the way they were implemented, that they were uncoordinated, and some officials pushed so much. And so give you one good example is that we have set this carbon neutrality goal for 2060. But even last year, some local officials start to push cutting back the production capacity wherever the emission is high. That is kind of converting these long-term goals into very short-term pressure on the growth momentum. This is something we need to try to correct. You mentioned that you used the term crackdown on some of the economic activities. I probably would not use that term. Crackdown is what people feel they are seeing. But for taking the platform economy as an example, this is one of the most dynamic economic sector in China, but there are also some problems within that sector, the monopoly, misbehavior, and so on. So the goal of the policy is trying to regulate the sector and promote orderly development. But as I said, the implementation sometimes causes some chaos.
Thanks, Yiping. That last comment you made, in particularly, sort of objecting to the use of the word crackdown, actually flows on to my next question. But can I just really quickly ask a follow-on to that first one? Yiping, you talked about the rest of this year stimulus, monetary and fiscal stimulus being on the cards. So in your view, because that's the traditional playbook of Beijing, right? Economy slows, the government jumps in, particularly by financing infrastructure spending, which you also mentioned. So just a short, sharp answer. So your view is that that's likely again, and that Beijing still has the capacity and the will to respond to a slowdown using that traditional playbook.
Well, I think the traditional playbook, but it's being played out slightly differently. Number one, I think probably because the policymakers now have a lot of things on their hands, and that's why their attention is probably diversified a bit into different directions. The international conflict, the domestic political transition, and so on. So it's kind of a bit slow compared to before. The second thing is, I think while certainly I strongly believe the government still has enough room to implement very aggressive stimulus policies, including the fiscal policies. Aggregate public liability as a portion to GDP is still relatively small. And I think the government can do it if they're willing to do it. But if you say this is still the older book, the one thing that will be new is in the past, when the government start to invest more, it's basically on the traditional infrastructure. And now they can invest more, but more on the new digital infrastructure, on the green economy, on innovation, and even support the livelihood of the people. So the same spending, but on different projects.
Okay, thanks, Yiping. Look, I'll go to what was going to be my second question now, again to you, Yiping, and then Jane, I'll head to you next. Yiping, while we've got you here, I just can't resist taking a step back from the immediate challenges of China's economy and asking you to help inform our audience today about how we should understand and monitor China's economy. Look, you keep abreast of the common narratives and assessments of China's economy coming out of the West, like Australia. Are there particular aspects of China's economy that you think are often commonly misunderstood, leading to poorly formed assessments about current conditions and prospects? Just to refer to something you said before, where in the West we often talk about a tech crackdown, and you reacted to that. So, to put that general question, are there things that you often read written in the Western press, for example, by Western analysts, and you think they're a misreading of current conditions?
There are probably too many to mention, but I just give you one example, and I think that probably helps. In the West, the people will look at what the PBOC is doing, and our monetary policy decision is not made at the PBOC, but most of the decisions are made at the State Council. And people think that that's more like a central planning stuff, not the typical market decision. And the PBOC often still uses some quantitative measures, even administrative measures, in addition to the typical interest rate measures when they make monetary policies. That is being criticized by many outside of China for thinking like they're still doing the same central planning policy. My view is that you should think about these against the economic background. China is still a developing country. China is still a transition economy, which means adopting the RBA approach or the Fed approach, the framework, might not actually work for the Chinese economy. So that's why sometimes decision at the State Council could be better than at the PBOC, because when the monetary policy is made, the transmission mechanism is not really smooth. And you need high authorities to ensure that these policy goals are achieved, particularly when the economy still has some SOEs and so on. So we often find that there are some peculiar elements in the policy-making processes, but we have to look at these measures against the background that China is still a developing country and a large transition economy.
Okay, thanks very much, Yiping. All right, I'll let you catch your breath. That's an important point, right? Just because there are differences in the way China and Western countries enact their economic policy, it doesn't necessarily mean that one is less effective, because it could actually be quite well matched to its current and historical conditions.
I probably should add, of course, we are moving toward a market economy, but
Sure.
This is still in transition.
Okay, thanks, Yiping. All right, Jane, if I can turn to you next, and then I'll go to you, Su-Lin. Jane, I'd like to now, Yiping's given us a very good overview of how he sees developments on the ground in China. What I'd like to turn to you now on is the spillovers of conditions, economic activity in China to Australia's own economic prospects. To you, I'd like to focus on aggregate level context, and then I'll go to Su-Lin for some more granular and business level analysis. In short, Jane, what I'd like to ask you is, can you illuminate our audience on the extent to which we should expect economic fluctuations in China to spill over to affect Australia's own prospects? Let me give you an example of this, if you don't mind. I was reading a commentary piece in the Australian Financial Review just last week, less than a week ago, by Karen Maley. And here's what she says, Jane. She said, quote, "Australian policymakers could well be tempted to feel a certain sense of smugness at the IMF's decision to upgrade the country's growth outlook for the year to 4.2%. Instead," she says, "they should be deeply concerned about the IMF's deepening anxiety about China, Australia's largest trading partner, as Beijing's drastic measures to contain COVID-19 are exacerbating the downward spiral in the country's property market," and so on, close quote. So, Jane, you can see the link there. economic prospects in China have taken a turn for the worse. So we've got to be ready for this, that negative spillover to hit us. Is that how you understand economic spillovers, Jane? I mean, what do the facts and evidence, the historical record, is there a straightforward and dependable relationship between economic activity in China and the spillover to Australia?
Thanks, James. That's a really great question, and I think that media example is, really sort of a good example of how the standard media narrative plays out here in Australia. I guess the simple version of it's always been that when China sneezes, Australia will catch a cold. And, I can recall instances, one that really stuck with me when China's growth forecast was downgraded from 6.9 to 6.7% many years ago now. And there was visible panic across the media and I guess across some sectors of the community as they absorb those media stories. But actually, I think if you look into the past data, and it's pretty easy to do, Australia's export growth to China has had this remarkable upward trend, really. I mean, there's always blips across, if you're looking at monthly data, but the overall trend, I think over the last 10, 15, even 20 years has been upwards, whereas China's GDP growth, really high for a lot of that period, a few stumbles, slowing down in these recent years, where you'd actually start to think that almost the reverse was true, that when China was sneezing, somehow our export growth in particular was becoming healthier. And that's not quite as ironic as it sounds. I mean, if we look back, for example, to the GFC, the global financial crisis, there's a period in which China's growth is slowing, but their massive 4 trillion renminbi fiscal stimulus focused on infrastructure turns out to be really good for Australian resource demand. And so we get a resource boom and an iron ore boom in particular. And I think if you look at the data for 2020, 21 as well, the aggregate numbers look really good, leaving aside the political tensions, but looking at that slowdown in China's growth imposed by COVID, sort of part one, we still see Australian exports booming. And I know you want me to stick to the aggregates there, but it really is so important to look, under those aggregated numbers, because of course the 2020-21 stories are largely about iron ore, and there are a lot of other sectors that are struggling. And so, it's not to say that that media narrative is entirely wrong. I think, and again, what we're seeing this year, it's going to be a pretty big stumble for China. I think there's no way that's not going to hurt significant sectors of the economy. Looking into the longer term, we've got to understand, what a slowdown in growth means for growth of their incomes and how that translates and impacts on, the range of sectors that we supply our goods and services to them for.
Okay, thanks, Jane. So it's certainly not a one-to-one positive relationship. That's something that we can confidently say. All right, Jane, just a quick follow-up here. Of course, when we're talking about Australia-China economic, particularly trade and investment relations these days, we've got to talk about politics as well. I mean, the potential for politics to spill over and impact trade and investment really is front and centre in discussions of the Australia-China economic relationship these days. Now, I know that you've quite recently published some peer-reviewed research on that precise topic. So I just wanted to invite you to brief our audience today. What does it reveal about the potential for political disputes between China and Australia and its strategic partners to spill over and hurt that economic relationship?
Yeah, thanks, James. It's actually quite a different narrative than the one that we've just talked about in terms of the economics. And gee, it's nice to focus, purely on the economics for a while, but here I am back on the politics as well. The general narrative, I think, that you see in the press about our political relationship and how it links to trade is that there is no link. There's a lot of talk about resilience in the economy. I see you write about it, a number of others. Again, you'll look in, for example, maybe let's not talk too much about wine, but I mean, wine took a huge hit last year as expected with the size of the tariffs. It was kind of on the chopping block, and, the value of Australian exports to wine exports to China has absolutely plummeted 97%, I think, in that 1 year. But again, still sort of sticking to the aggregate numbers, of course, political scientists and economists, others as well, have spent centuries trying to understand the relationship between politics and trade. And there are a range of different arguments, that good political relations strengthen trading links and that ultimately prevents war, is a liberal, kind of quite optimistic narrative, not one that seems to be playing out now, a reverse one being, and the one that we might be living in, that the deteriorating political relationship will end up having, if not immediate, then long-term impacts on our trading relationship. And there's something about that resonates with reality as we observe it in the last year. And yet, if you look at the aggregate numbers over the last 20 years, there is this story, or at least according to my own research, of a resilience, of the idea that you can kind of leave politics out of it. But I don't think it's a good idea to look backwards in order to understand the future. It doesn't go well using a rear view mirror to try and see the tree up front. So I'm not necessarily going to say that means all will be well in the future.
Fair enough. And Jane, the other thing I understand about your research is it didn't just look between China's economic relationship with Australia, but other countries as well. So was that a fairly consistent finding, at least in the historical data, that the spillovers from politics to economics tend to be pretty modest?
Yeah, in fact, when my PhD students looked at even a wider range of countries, 10 or 15 countries, we focused on 4, the Quad countries, to see how their own bilateral political relations with China had changed across time and whether that impacted on their exports to China. Depending on the time period, there were a couple of small effects actually for India and Japan back in the early 2000s. But again, the aggregate story was one of resilience. We're now doing some work looking at whether that's also the case between America and its trading partners. And I'm not sure that same resilience is going to be there. But anyway, watch this space for that.
Okay, great. Okay, Su-Lin, thank you for your patience. I'm keen to get to you now and drill down into this discussion I've been having with Jane about Australia-China economic relationship at that more aggregate level, and get into the more granular stuff. Now, Su-Lin, you've led much of the international reporting of steps that Beijing has taken since May 2020 to disrupt Australia's exports. I particularly remember an article you wrote in early November 2020 that said that we could expect disruption to copper and sugar on top of already the disruptions that had already occurred to lobster and timber. And sure enough, that came to fruition. So clearly you've got some very good sources. Can I begin by asking you this question? How should we in Australia understand Beijing's motivations for targeting some of Australia's exports? A bit of a background on this question. I mean, the standard line, Su-Lin, and one that I've presented quite confidently, to be frank, is that Beijing has been exercising coercive pressure on Canberra to change its political positions. Now, I do note, however, that others have said that this might not be the only or even perhaps the main motivation. I mean, I think of someone like David Urendau. I'm sure you'd be familiar with David, the former economics correspondent of The Australian. He talks about that trade disruption being more about retaliation for Canberra blocking Chinese investment proposals. I think of my colleague and co-author Wei-Huang Zhou from the University of New South Wales and Stephen Kirshner from the United States Studies Centre. They've said something similar about it being retaliation for the anti-dumping tariffs that Canberra has put on Chinese imports for many years and on a far greater range of imports than China has targeted in terms of Australian wine and Australian barley. Let's not forget Wang Xining's, the number 2 at the Chinese embassy in Canberra, his memorable metaphor last year, quote, "China is not a cow." I don't think anybody should fancy the idea to milk China when she's in her prime and plot to slaughter it in the end, close quote. In other words, rather than imagining or expecting that trade disruption would change Canberra's political positions, it's more about standing up for China's national pride and dignity than anything else. Su-Lin, what's your take on those competing explanations?
Well, that's a lot. Well, I'm going to start with, before I go into retaliation and a comment on retaliation, I'm just going to give some background. I think there's very little nuance around, the trade dealings between China and Australia here locally in Australia. What you were talking about, the anti-dumping, just to be clear, China ascended the WTO, 20 years ago, and they have to play by the rules of the trading fraternity globally. So one of the things that countries do is that if trade isn't fair, if it's deemed as dumping, as in you're selling it cheaper in elsewhere than you are locally, then that's seen as sort of trying to carve out a bit of market share by selling it so cheaply. So countries are free to complain and act against countries that are doing that to their local markets. So up until this 2020, when the all that trade war, let's call it, started between Australia and China, I think there were about 85 to 87, 85 anti-dumping cases that Australia has brought against China. So it's anti-dumping complaints are a protectionist nature. It's saying, we want to protect our local economy and so on and so forth. So China hasn't complained about any of those. They've copped it and they've had to pay the tariffs. And so their goods coming into Australia would have been, had the higher duty and more expensive for local users and buyers. In return, China hadn't actually complained about hadn't imposed any anti-dumping duties on Australia up until the point, except for until May, which was the barley ones, the two anti-dumping and the countervailing duties, and then the wine ones. So that's 4. So yeah, so just as a setup, as the background to it is that China has been paying all these duties to Australia, and they haven't actually imposed anything on Australia until now. So now Australia is saying that there is no dumping. It's a natural process, it's a legal process where the two countries then go to the WTO and have a dispute arbitration panel, decide whether or not they were fairly imposed. And that's what's going to happen with barley and wine. So that's where we are at. Now, in terms of retaliation, now you have to understand that I think when, first of all, China, all these goings about in WTO is considered legal, so it's not retaliation. Now, when you talk about retaliation on those products, one could also say legally that they won't actually retaliation. No, nobody recognizes that as a legitimate trade war because those restrictions were never formal. So you can't actually, they haven't actually put out a memo saying, okay, we're going to stop buying coal, etc. It's all an informal process, downstream. So in that sense, there were never actually proper retaliation in that sense. You could say they could argue that we've decided that we don't need so much copper, we don't need so much coal from these places. They could argue that it's a business decision not to buy these products from Australia. So in that sense, they haven't actually breached any rules because they were not formal. So the general sense is that China doesn't want to retaliate or fight with Australia. I think everyone in China loves Australian goods, and certainly they want that relationship to go on. And you can see by the numbers that, it's still very strong. Nothing's, not billions of dollars haven't walked out the door overnight. So certainly there's that feeling that, you want to keep trading. Obviously, outside of trading, as you were talking to Jane before about politics, there's a certain sense of, we have to make sure we look like we're standing out for some of our, what's going on between, if Australia's, saying certain things, obviously we don't know what the motivations are because everything is informal. So, but the general sense is that, yes, nobody wants a fight, and these are not retaliatory sort of attacks because, they still want that continued trade with Australia.
Thanks, Su-Lin. So it's certainly, from your perspective, it certainly sounds like it's a little bit more complicated than just story of Beijing is attacking our trade to change Canberra's political positions. That'd be a fair summary?
Yeah, exactly right. Because if, if it wanted to go all out, it would have made it quite formal, but then that would be a bit, you have to think it's all very informal at the moment, and still is. And some people don't even recognize them as restrictions. And granted, if you were to send, even if you send things that are restricted. Some batches of goods do actually get through.
Yep.
From time to time. It all depends.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Thanks, Su-Lin. Look,
actually, I would just say one thing, that the other thing about the landscape that Australia needs to be aware of is that aside from this 2-year saga around these restrictions, there are also a lot of changes within the Chinese economy, as Ethan had said before. You know, structurally, it's changing. Supply side changes, for example, the steel production and all that. So Australia must be more cognizant of these long-term structural changes more than they should be staring down this barrel of, oh my God, these restrictions. Oh, how terrible is that? And then sort of that you know, he said, she said battle going on. But really rather look at what it is that Australia needs to do to work with China over their long-term structural changes, like steel. Steel production is coming down. That needs to be looked at. You know, more important, I think, for the long-term longevity of the two-way trade between the two countries.
Right. Yeah. And I think probably coal is a good example of that, where our current discussion is very much focused on China not buying our coal because of the political dispute. But of course, we know the long-term trend of where that trade would be headed anyway. Su-Lin, can I follow up with another question here? And it has struck me that since, I mean, in 2020, it seemed like, particularly towards the end of the year, it seemed like every week there was a new trade disruption. I think we finished the year with about 12 different Australian exports experiencing disruption in the Chinese market. But come 2021, it seemed to level off. Now, to be clear, nothing's been removed, right? So there's still a state of disruption between Australia and China, but the pace of escalation certainly slowed or leveled off. Now, sometimes I hear the assessment that that's because China ran out of easy targets. Sure, it could hit iron ore, but that would hurt China itself. Another thing sometimes I hear is that China is cognizant of the international reputational damage it's experiencing from its trade disruption of Australian goods. You've got, you know, countries in Europe looking at Australia and thinking, oh, goodness me, could this happen in our relationship with China as well? And that might dissuade Beijing from going further. So can I just ask you, I mean, how real in your assessment is it for, you know, this disruption to widen, particularly say if, you know, the current coalition government wins the May federal election and continues its current approach to managing China relations?
I think that, you know, all these decisions that we made, whether you can consider the marginal exports, and therefore, you know, you can sort of sacrifice them, and China's happy to sacrifice them all. I think a lot of the decisions were made from a business perspective as to whether or not they can cope with that loss of that trade. So what is interesting is I've just sort of done a bit of a chat around, but there's a sense that instead of looking at all these sort of, you know, retaliation, let's just call it, China's been looking inward to its own supplies and looking at, right, now we've got difficult relationships, but rather than maybe just, you know, calling time on copper or sugar or anything else, is to look at their own supply. So they're not working very hard at securing other supplies of minerals at the moment and looking at other things across, you know, say, for example, iron ore across different places like mines in Guinea, and, you know, securing more relationships in Brazil. And so they're looking at saying, rather than having an argument up front, I think the sense is that they're looking at securing more of their own to say, if things should go really, really sour, okay, whatever, we can probably just rely on these other supplies than, you know, working at retaliating. Whether or not they retaliate, I think depends on very much their supplies and whether they can actually secure more of it. So it's hard to say whether or not they're going to pull one out or anything, but I think it all comes down to whether they've got enough supplies of these alternative supplies of these goods that they want out, that they have with Australia at the moment. So there's a lot of talk about that they're shoring things up, you know, rare earth, nickel, you know, everything across, even to iron ore, obviously. So I think that's where, if you want to know whether or not, you know, China's going to pull the rug off, you know, from under another country's, you know, feet, is to look at what they're trying to shore up in terms of their supplies, you know, and then that may well be a sign that that's something they would use if things go terribly, but there's no guarantee, because what's happened with the, you know, those restrictions in 2020 hadn't happened again in 2021, as you said. So I don't think it's like a sure thing strategy that they're trying to retaliate against another country.
Right. So we better not. It probably wouldn't be wise to start chuckling and say that Beijing's run out of options for hurting Australia's economy. There is potential. So while it still retains a pragmatic element to its decision making, we're not necessarily out of the worst of it yet. Okay. Thanks, Su-Lin. Yiping, can I bring you back into discussion here? And then we're going to go to our audience Q&A after that. So can I encourage our audience to please submit any questions they have? I'd be happy to direct those to our panelists today. But Yiping, one final question before we go to our audience Q&A. Can I ask you this question? There was, I think, for a long time, a fairly comfortable consensus view, certainly amongst economists like me, that China's policymakers are fundamentally pragmatic, focused on enacting economic policy that delivers rising living standards for China's population. Does that still hold today, that pragmatism? Now, I ask that not only in the context of developments in China, but also elsewhere, in the West. For example, it seems to me, Yiping, that in Washington these days, Washington is quite comfortable trading off some economic gains for perceived national security benefits or to advance its relative position in geostrategic competition with Beijing. I mean, just yesterday, for example, I was reading some new research that documented the number of China-based entities, so mostly Chinese companies, on the US government's entity list has gone from 130 in January 2018 to 532 now. I mean, you want to talk about an escalation of disruption. That's quite a stark statistic. So, Yiping, how do you see Beijing's appetite for trading off economic gains for other objectives?
Well, I think, James, the fundamental goal of achieving strong growth and delivering better benefits to the population is still there. And I think the party actually said our ultimate goal is to satisfy the increasing need for the people to enjoy better lives. That's whatever it is. So I think it's still there. But the things have changed to some extent. Now, just to take what you mentioned a minute ago about what the US is doing now. Obviously, the policymakers will have to think what happens if there are more restrictions on the US from the US side and the other side. So, which basically means we could no longer rely on the so-called globalization infrastructure to develop our economy. Remember, when China started economic reform in 1978, the world was onto the new wave of globalization. We could basically make investment, do trade wherever delivers the best returns for us. We don't really worry too much about the others and so on. But now it's very different. And that's why if China probably will reach the so-called high income economy entry level. But there will be more restrictions if you want to move up the industrial ladder. The question is, if the US is going to impose more restrictions on us, do we need to focus more on domestic innovation? This sometimes might not be the best, the most efficient way of doing it. As economists, we would argue. But if the potential risk is there that if I don't do it myself, there will be a day that I will not have anything. And that, I think, is something that is affecting economic decision. And these economic decisions sometimes can also affect, is related to security, safety in other areas. So my short answer to your question is, I still certainly think economic development is the most important goal, because to a large extent, as you probably would agree, that also underpins the legitimacy of the regime at the moment. But we have to admit that the environment has changed quite a bit, and the policymakers will have to take more into their consideration.
Thanks, Yiping. But it sounds pretty clear from what you're saying is that there hasn't been a U-turn in terms of how China enacts economic policy. That spirit of pragmatism still remains the chief guiding principle. It sounds like. Is that fair to say?
Absolutely.
Okay,
Absolutely.
good. I didn't want to put words into your mouth, Yiping, so I'm glad you've been able to confirm that. All right, let me now go to some questions from our audience. Look, the first question is from David Thomas, and this is a question focused on Australia. So Jane or Su-Lin, I might, let me just read it out, and then either of you feel free to jump in and have a go at answering it. David says, I was shocked to hear that one of Australia's leading super funds recently made a decision to halve their exposure to China, with the reason given that they fear, quote, fear an invasion of Taiwan. Essentially, David is asking, I mean, in your view, does that, I mean, is this a legitimate decision-making process for an Australian super fund these days, or is this an example of panic dictating private sector decision-making? So it's a tough question, but Jane or Su-Lin, I wondered if one of you might want to jump in on that.
That is a tough question, James.
One for you, Jane.
I am not certainly going to try and put a probability on the likelihood that any kind of military conflict happens with Taiwan from the mainland. But, that is what businesses are in the business of having to do. They are learning to assess risks. And so I think it's also not my position to tell a super fund manager where they should invest their funds. And if they're making that decision, the question I guess I'd ask is, where are they getting their knowledge from? So if you were to just read, for example, the Australian newspaper every day, then you might take it as a good idea to get the hell out of there. Whereas if you read more deeply into the situation, into the history, into an understanding of where the United States is at, into a whole range of positions that affect the likelihood of that outcome, and still made that decision, then again, who am I to suggest that you should do otherwise? So I don't know if it's panic or not. I'd say you really want to have a good, strong sense of history and a really detailed risk assessment when you're dealing with something as complicated as that.
Thanks, Jane. Su-Lin, anything from you? You don't have to.
No, I think I'm with Jane on this. You can never guess what's in the minds of people, and certainly, as Jane is saying, was saying, this is all risk management. But I think people need to be cognizant of the fact that the rhetoric around generated by a lot of places are also opinion driven, and this is not fact driven and evidence. I mean, if that's the belief if they want to, I suppose, factor in beliefs and, ideology into their risk management, then certainly they could do that. We're not, like Jane said, it's up to them. But I think it's more nuanced than that. I've been asked this question many times, is there going to be an impending war? I haven't sensed that more than, just if you don't read all that opinion stuff, you don't sense that there is going to be an impending war in minutes. So, yeah, okay. That's what I would say.
Okay, EP, can I just tweak this? It's a little bit of an aside from the question. But what are your views of China's long-run growth prospects? I mean, the question kind of touches on this, right? Because we've had an Australian super fund that's halved its exposure to China. Now, the specific reason they gave is they're worried about an invasion of Taiwan. But I'm sure there's a lot of Australian companies also thinking, is China's long-term growth prospects as positive as they were 10 years ago? Now, you've got a colleague, Su-Lin, of course, who's very upbeat about China's long-term growth prospects. What's your assessment?
Well, I mean, I think talking about the long-term growth prospect is a tough one, partly because the global environment has changed, but also because the Chinese growth model is also shifting from what we call input-driven growth model to now more innovation-driven growth. My own sense is that if we get the policies right, definitely, the Chinese economy will continue to prosper. But of course, we all have to admit, James, growth rate will come down. As I hinted earlier, China will probably become a high-income economy end of this year or maybe next year. We are very close to that entry level already. So if that's the case, I think what you look at the Chinese economy, we are seeing a number of areas where it's very lively, the high-end manufacturing sector, the big tech sector, and so on. So I think as long as the government leaves the market to determine resource allocation, allows the entrepreneurs to play active roles, like what is happening in the Pearl River Delta and the Yangtze River Delta, I have no doubt that the Chinese economy will continue to grow very strongly.
Thanks, Yiping. That's a very important observation you made in the sense of singling out those two particular regions, because I mean, you know, these are areas that you are pointing to that are a reality today with the current situation in China, and you think those particular regions do actually augur quite well for China's long-run growth prospects. Okay, thank you for that. Su-Lin, I've got another question here. I think it's probably best to go to you. It's a question about Chinese investment, which I know is something that you follow extremely closely. Jane, you feel free to jump in. I'll direct it to Su-Lin first. This is from James Clark. He particularly references the new KPMG Sydney University Chinese investment report, noting there's a decline of Chinese FDI into Australia to $585 million US last year, compared with 11.5 billion only 5 years earlier. So a massive reduction in Chinese FDI inflows. James just would like to hear the thoughts of the panel on this decline in Chinese investment. What's driving it? And where do you see it likely to go in the future? I mean, is this a new normal where Chinese investment in Australia just sort of, you know, bumps along the bottom? Big question, but if you can give us a nice, concise answer, that'd be great.
I'll go first. I think I just recently looked at the Foreign Investment Review Board numbers. That's approvals, applications for investments into Australia. And the Chinese approvals have stabilized. So it's been dropping quite a lot. But the biggest drop actually wasn't in the last, couple of years. It was actually between, let's have a look, 16 to about 18. So this is during the time when Australia was, there was a lot of the new surcharges on property purchases and penalties and fees were coming up a lot to prohibit, too much foreign purchases of property. And then, of course, there was the curtailment of capital outflows out of China. So in that time, that drop was the biggest. So, but in the last couple of years, the drop has slowed. And so the applications for new investments into Australia has actually stabilized. A lot lower, the approvals at about $13 billion worth of approvals than, at the height of everything, which is nearly $50 billion in a single year. So that's a good sense that, it's probably slowed down the drop off, but these are just approvals and applications. So whether they actualize into real transactions is a different thing. Now, what the KPMG study would show that they are actual numbers. So the numbers have actually quite steeply fallen off, including the last 2 years and the last 5-7 years as well. So altogether, it's a big drop off in actual transactions. But it could get better, because if the approvals have actually stabilized and there's a flat line at the moment, then you could say that maybe, that the retractions are slowed. And so maybe the actualizations will pick up at some point.
Yeah, I guess it's quite possible, and indeed perhaps even likely, that political tensions don't so much spill over to hurt trade as much as they hurt investment. Jane, is that your sense?
That's what I'm wondering about. I mean, like that you gave a really good set of different reasons why we might be experiencing the trade challenges that we are: pride, coercion, retaliation, anti-dumping. There are a whole bunch of different factors, and I think they probably all play a role on the trade front. Many of them are likely to play a role on the investment front as well. And leaving aside Su-Lin's, or accepting Su-Lin's point about the numbers that they might not be as bad as they look, they're pretty massive. The drop is significant. I think it is easy, and we have seen our treasurer, turn down investment opportunities that were a little bit questionable for some of us. The Chinese might then feel less welcome. It's an easier decision for them to switch their investment portfolios, I think, to other countries than it is to change those trading links that maybe take a lot longer to form and sustain over time. So yeah, I wouldn't be surprised, and if only I had the data, but I don't, to look at just how that political relationship impacts on investment. I suspect there's more of a story there than there is on the trade front.
Okay, great.
And not just coming from the Australian side, but from the Chinese side as well. Lots of different levers that can be used to slow it down, and slowing down it has dramatically.
Okay, thanks, Jane. All right, folks, look, we've just got 5 minutes to go, so I want to wrap things up. Yiping, Jane and Su-Lin, here's the closing question for you. Can you give us your 30-second answer? Yiping Huang, do you think the best days of the Australia-China economic relationship are behind us, or is there a brighter future ahead?
I think it's probably behind us. I'm a bit more pessimistic, but this is not just the bilateral story.
Sure.
I think it's a global story. With the sanctions on Russia, the extreme measures adopted, I think the foundation of globalization has shifted. And that's why I'm quite pessimistic.
Right. Okay. So some pessimism there, but certainly not limited to the specifics of the Australia-China. Jane Golly, what's your take?
So easy to be pessimistic, James, but my closing point would be about Yiping's the growth slowdown. And as he said, we all know it's coming. It's been coming for a long time. All countries' growth rates slow down over the longer term as they develop. Even when the Chinese economy is at 3%, even at 2%, it is still going to be the most significant contributor to global economic output of any country in the world. And again, my closing point is about narratives. We talk about China sneezing, catching a cold, and there's catastrophe here when they're crumbling, they're collapsing. There's a whole collapses narrative about that. It hasn't transpired. Things might, expect the unexpected. It might not be as bad as people are making out in the press.
Yeah, that's right. Once that base of your economy is so large, even a smaller percentage change actually translates to a bigger increase in new aggregate purchasing power, right? And that's certainly something we've seen over the last 5 years. Su-Lin Tan, are you going to send us out on an optimistic or a pessimistic note?
I think neither. I'm just going to give you the business view on this. I'm going to just say that to Yiping's point that economies do change, they mature, they start new, they grow. And so I think the relationship with China, obviously, is Australia had all the low-hanging fruits, when it's booming. And that makes sense because it is growing 8%. Surely they'll demand all the iron ore in the world, and that totally makes sense. As it matures, it would also change. And China is changing. Its market is changing. For example, if you look at steel production, they are just recently, just in last 9 days, they've demanded that 30 million tons of production come down. So they're doing that because they want to aim at their emissions reduction. So as they head towards these goals, it will change their market structurally. And if that changes, then demand will also change. So the movements of supply and demand will move accordingly, and that will affect trade with whether it's Australia or South Africa or any other country. So, and I think in that sense, I don't think it's going to be the big boom as the low-hanging fruits have been picked, but certainly it will just meander along in a different direction and things will change. But also importantly is I don't think the trade's going to disappear overnight because supply chains don't disappear overnight. They're there for quite a long time. You can't just yank off pipelines and this and that tomorrow to start something new. So it's going to be an altering landscape, I think.
A different relationship rather than a more positive or negative one.
Correct.
Okay, thanks very much. On that diplomatic note, David Goodman, I'm going to send it back to you to wrap things up.
Thank you, James. And I would like to thank Professor Yiping Huang, Professor Jane Golly, Su-Lin Tan, and yourself, James Lawrenson, for today's discussion. If you would, we would like to ask members of the audience to complete the feedback form, which you will receive in the email, because we like to be able to improve what we're doing and how we're doing it. But on that note, I'd just like to thank you for attending and the participants for speaking. Thank you all very much indeed, and enjoy the rest of your day.